There's no indication that Russia would stop if Ukraine ceded some or all of its territory. There's no reason to think that Russia wouldn't then take, let's say, Moldova, Transnistria. Why wouldn't they incorporate Belarus directly? Why wouldn't they go back further into Georgia, Poland, Baltics? There's sort of no thought on sort of how this solves a problem. The problem at the moment on the ground is Russian expansionism. A legitimate question is, how do you stop that?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Discourses of Our Time. Our discussion today is about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which is actually approaching its second anniversary in February. For the purpose of our discussion, I invited Dr. Andrew Barnes, who is a prominent American scholar of Russian and post-Soviet politics. His well-known book, Owning Russia, The Struggle Over Factories, Farms, and Power, is a must-read book for anyone who is interested in Russian politics and especially Russian economy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He authored dozens of peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, book reviews, and analytical pieces, which appeared in various publications over the years in this country. Welcome, Dr. Barnes, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, as I mentioned, we are approaching the second anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So when I'm trying to contemplate the fact that in the 21st century, in Europe, we are having actual full-scale, the ground war, the war of conquest, which has been launched by one revanchist power against its smaller neighbor, by which, of course, I mean the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it all seems quite surreal. So my question is that, how did we get here? And I guess the second part is tied to the first part. Could it be avoided, and how?
Well, that's a huge question, and
it is.
We'll talk about it in multiple ways over the course of this conversation. But fundamentally, and I'll probably return to this a couple of times, the reason for the invasion is choice on the Russian side. It wasn't forced upon Russia. It wasn't forced upon Putin. There were other ways to resolve the issues that Russia or Putin had with Ukraine. And so despite that, the Russian side made the choice to invade. The invasion has taken longer and has lasted for 2 years and will presumably last longer because the response, I think, was not anticipated by the Russian side. Putin didn't expect that Ukraine would fight back this hard, didn't expect that the West would unite in terms of sanctions, or that the West would continue to provide aid to Ukraine, all of which is still tentative, right? There's no guarantee this will last indefinitely in terms of support for Ukraine. But I think that Putin thought the invasion would be easy. Most folks who launch invasions expect that they'll be easy, and then they're usually proven wrong. But in terms of why we're here, it comes down to choice on the Russian side, I'm afraid.
Okay. So many in the world blame the West for the outbreak of this war along the lines that the West's promise of Ukraine's NATO membership actually provoked Russia. And this is how we actually got here. And they specifically point to the 2008, the NATO summit in Bucharest. However, anyone who is even remotely familiar with the Bucharest summit knows that that summit would not be exaggeration to say it effectively killed the Ukraine's NATO membership perspectives in the foreseeable future because it gave very vague promises of membership, nothing clear, and the whole policy was very ill-conceived and ill-defined. What is your take on this? Can we really blame the West for the outbreak of this war?
My short answer to that question is no. And I think a longer answer is helpful because there are a lot of people who tell some version of that story that, the West drove Russia to this, the NATO drove Russia to this, the EU, the United States. That's just not right. And there are a couple of important ways in which that narrative is incorrect. One is that it implies or states outright that the movement of Ukraine or Georgia or the Baltic states earlier or whatever toward NATO membership and EU membership is somehow driven by the West, that this is the West trying to grab new countries. In reality, the interest in joining these larger organizations is driven from the Ukrainian side or the Estonian side or the Georgian side, right? These governments want to be included in these larger entities. And in fact, the Western organizations are like, wait, slow down. We'll give you some vague promise of maybe someday in the future, if you do some stuff that we won't really lay out, maybe you can join, right? That the West is the one who's slow rolling this, and it's the Central European and East European and Caucasian states that are pushing it. So I'd like to get that cleared up. Second, as you say, it's not like Ukraine was about to join NATO tomorrow, right? I mean, that just isn't the case. Linked to what we just said, this was going to be a slow process if it was ever going to happen at all. And so the idea that Russia had to invade in February 2 years ago, or else it would lose Ukraine. First of all, maybe that's not a justification for invading another country because they want to join NATO. But even if it were, it wasn't like it was about to happen in March of 2 years ago. So no, there's just no empirical reason to argue that Western expansion drove this, both in the sense that it's not driven by Western interests and the fact that even if it was ever going to happen, it wasn't going to happen imminently.
Okay. The many experts speculated years ago that at some point, sooner or later, Putin would reach the point of overstretch after him putting down violently Chechen uprising, after his invasion of Georgians and his involvement, military involvement in Syrian civil war and his adventures in elections and the political systems of European Union countries. Do you think he reached the point of overstretch? To me, it does not look like he did. So I'm very curious about your approach because his regime did not collapse. He managed to keep the power against all expectations. Russian economy did not collapse. They're not doing very well, but they're doing okay. They found the new markets in India and China for their energy resources, so they rerouted quite successfully from Europe all the way to the east and the southeast. And very importantly, also, the Russian army, who sustained massive casualties and suffered some initial setbacks in the last year around Kyiv and Kharkiv and Kherson, lost some territory. They managed quite successfully to hold off Ukrainian counteroffensive since the last spring. So is this his point of overstretch, or he still has a lot of steam to go?
I think that's a really interesting question and an important one without a simple answer, unless the simple answer is, well, we'll see when it happens. So let me say a few things about that. One is that folks have been alleging that he's reached his moment of overstretch for quite some time, right? Maybe not right when he came to power at the beginning of the 2000s, but by the time we got to 2008, certainly by the time he did the switch with Medvedev, and then he comes back with his, second round as in the presidency and so on. Oh, this can't last, right? He's interfering too ham-handedly in the economy, so that won't last. Or he's coming down too heavily on civil society, that won't last. And they all have lasted. I think it should be clear at this point that Putin is very skilled tactically. It's not 100% clear what his long-term strategy is or long-term goals are, but he's very good, I think, at playing the hand that gets dealt to him. And so I thought from at least 15 years ago, when he started more and more overtly sort of poking at NATO, poking at the West, right, doing overflights near Alaska or incursions on the border of the Baltics or all these sorts of things, they were sort of just small enough to not provoke a large response. He was able to poke and prick and sort of move and advance to the point where he's able to launch a full-scale invasion right down in Georgia. And basically it's treated as a small thing, like, well, maybe that's kind of internal politics or something, right? He's able to just push the line, which is probably what he thought, he would encounter when he invaded Ukraine, right? He launched a full-scale invasion because Ukraine is big and taking over and monitoring the territory would be a large project. But I just don't think he expected a whole lot of pushback from the West. So anyway, he's able to do a lot of things that doesn't look like he should be able to do, because I think he's good at getting himself involved in places where a big loss is not possible. Now, Ukraine is different. A big loss is possible. I don't think he thought it was going to happen. But to be turned out of Ukraine would likely be devastating to him, which may explain why he's been so tenacious, even after the original plan didn't go the way he thought it would. So I could certainly see this turning out disastrously for him, right? I mean, if he had gotten routed with the Ukrainian counteroffensive this past season, that would have been a heck of a thing. But it didn't happen, right? They were able to play defense very well. Of course, it's easier to play defense than offense and so on. It's still not clear that this will be a grand success for him, but he has mitigated the disaster from his perspective, which is obviously very detrimental to Ukraine. So I can't say, oh, this is the end, because people thought this is the end a lot of times. At some point, we're going to be right. Just like for 70 years, people predicted the Soviet Union would fall. And at some point, they were right, but not because you could sort of see exactly what the cause was going to be coming. I think it's certainly still worth watching how well he maintains governance at home. But right now, he's doing it very effectively. Controls media, controls civil society, clearly got control of his generals, is willing to kill Prigozhin, all these sorts of things. So I don't know, but he's got a tough road to hoe, but he's been very good at that sort of thing for a long time.
Yeah. Many urge Ukraine, the politicians, industrialists, intellectuals, to cede to Russia the land which Russia occupies right now, which is approximately 20% of the Ukraine's sovereign territory as it's recognized in 1991 after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Do you think this will help? Do you think this will bring the peace in the region in Eastern Europe and will give Ukraine security if everything stops as it is right now and Russia maintains the captured territory?
Right. I would just add and emphasize that it's sovereign Ukrainian territory as recognized today by the international community as well.
Right. Absolutely.
You were not saying anything else. I just wanted to emphasize that. The second thing I would say is that the decision on what to cede or not cede is up to the Ukrainian population and government rather than to me. And so I'm not offering like suggestions for how to end the war. But your specific question is what would happen if they did. And I don't think there's any reason to think that Russia would stop, right? Russia hasn't even argued that it would stop, right? If you'll just cede us Crimea and eastern Ukraine, then we'll stop. They haven't even made that claim, nor would there be any reason to believe that claim if they made it, because at earlier points they had agreed to recognize sovereign territory of Ukraine, and now they haven't. So I can't see that as a long-term strategy, even if there were political support for it in Ukraine, which I don't think there is.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, Ukraine is rejecting any calls for ceasefire. Even yesterday or day before yesterday, President Zelensky stated that Russia would use this time to rearm itself, which I guess has a lot of reality in it. That probably will be the necessary breather for Russia to come back stronger.
Right. I can't say he's, I'm not going to endorse Zelensky either, but I think that there's all sorts of reasons to think that that's exactly what would happen. There's no wall between where Russia occupies now and Kyiv, right? There's no new security agreements where NATO has agreed that if Russia takes one step further, then that activates Article 5 or any of that sort of stuff. It's just sort of a promise of Putin, which clearly is not reliable.
Yeah. What do you think? What would you say is the lesson which the world can draw from this war?
Yeah, this may go back to something you said in your opening question, which is this surreality, if you like, of a land war in Europe, which folks thought was off the table. I'm probably in that camp, right? That, if you'd asked me in 2010 whether we'd have another large power war in Europe, that was sort of low on my list of concerns. This just makes clear that it's possible. What to do about that is a much more complicated question, right? You could leap immediately to, well, we need to build up more and more arms and more treaties and, launch preemptive wars or any of that sort of approach. You could also argue that we need to think about structures that incorporate rising powers or something like that. I'm not trying to argue that one needs to sort of cede territory to a revanchist power or anything like that. But are there ways to incorporate a rising China or a rising Russia or a different rising power that would bring them into an international system that doesn't rely on war to settle its conflicts? That's a bigger, harder question, but it's clearly one that needs to be undertaken. There was a decade or two where folks in the West, certainly the popular opinion in the West, was that individual acts of international terrorism were kind of the biggest security threat. But now we've got a full-on state-to-state war, which kills a lot more people than even the most horrible terrorist attacks. And so we need to remember to keep thinking about those kinds of conflicts, even for Western powers. These are not things that just happen off in the periphery, where they do enough damage that we should still think about them. But anyway, that's what I would say to learn is like, wow, we really need to keep remembering that war is never completely off the table. We need to keep our eye on that.
So power politics is not over by any stretch of imagination in the 21st century.
It's not over, and this was what I was trying to hint at earlier, is that maybe we need to think in terms other than simply power politics, right? I mean, the solution to power politics is have more power than the other side. That's a losing game, right? Not everybody can have more power than everybody. So instead, if we think about ways to make war a less attractive option or less often perceived as necessary or these sorts of things. I'm not trying to unleash a series of, wow, we need to get them before they get us, because I think that, like I said, is a losing game. You can't win that game forever. But thinking about different ways to avoid this sort of conflict in the long run.
Yeah. How would you explain Russian society's reaction to this war? Maybe more precisely, I should say absence of the reaction, because like we mentioned, 2 years passed since the beginning of the war, and there have been very, very few the protests, which actually have been pretty isolated incidents. Just lately, there are some the news coming out of Russia that the spouses of the servicemen of deployed the Russians are staging some protests, but at best they're very isolated in scope. And there is very strong anecdotal evidence that the male Russians who left Russia to avoid the draft, even amongst them, there is quite strong support for Russia's invasion in Ukraine. How would you explain this? Is this because of regime's successful coercive apparatus, repressive apparatus, the fear of the regime, or there is something deeper going on within the Russian society which can explain this silence towards the regime?
Yeah, I think that's another really good question, and scholars are paying attention to it as best they can. Scholarship on the region, would go ahead and note, has become quite difficult because you're just not safe to do research on the ground in Russia in a lot of cases. So we'll have to see what we can learn over time. And so a lot of people are asking this question. One thing to note is that response is not completely absent, that there have been some protests and some folks have been arrested, clearly. And this new group of women protesters, some folks have hope in that. Women have been successful in Russian protests in the past in ways that men haven't, or men have sort of stood behind. Women have been the front. And so that, for folks who would like to see pushback on the Putin regime, is at least encouraging, although nobody's sort of expecting it to topple the regime or change the policy in the short run. And so I do think that a big part of the answer to the question, though, is the successful operation of the coercive apparatus, right? When people go out in the streets, they get arrested, and that's dangerous, right? It's not like you get due process. It's not like that you get a speedy trial. It's not like you get to voice your opinion. You just become a tool for the regime. They hang on to you as long as they think it's useful. They may send you off to a horrible prison where you're as likely to die as not. So it's very dangerous to protest. There are also sort of carrots, right? If you're in an academic setting or a professional setting and you will speak up for the regime, then maybe you get promoted, or at least you don't get fired. There are a lot of folks who look at that and are not really happy to see colleagues do that, but maybe understand the pressures they're under. That's a moral question that's hard to judge, but so that there is that. folks who will say yes because they get things for it. But finally, the narrative that the regime tells is a constant narrative, one of Nazis in Ukraine and Western spies driving the whole thing. And so that's believed more broadly than folks who are outside can even fathom that it would be, right? In some ways, it's similar to folks on the left watching people in the United States on the right spout things that they just can't believe anybody would believe, and folks on the right feel the same way about folks on the left. The fact that so many of us are living in different realities and unable to comprehend sort of how someone else sees the reality is a real feature of sort of contemporary politics, I think, not just in Russia, but it's important to remember that it is a feature in Russia, and that control over the media is starker there than it is here. So I think it's a combination of those factors, and what that means for future action is hard to say. It actually leaves me often pretty depressed, but helps explain where we are.
Yeah. In the past century, in the 20th century, the Russian Empire, first the Tsarist empires and the Soviet, collapsed twice. And both times, this collapse was followed by short-lived, quite chaotic experiment with democracy. In 1917, we know in the midst of the World War I, Russia collapsed, disintegrated, and democratic government lasted merely for 7-8 months. Then we know what happened. The communists came, Bolsheviks, establishing totalitarian regime for 7 years. And in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this short-lived democratic experience turned into the chaos, leading to the rise of Putin's authoritarian revanchist regime. So it almost became a pattern, if we can deduct the conclusion from two events. Why, in your opinion, why Russia keeps failing to establish a democracy? What is going on here?
Right. You're asking really good, deep questions. I'll also point out that in 1905, there was an experiment with at least liberalization of the authoritarian regime, have a legislature, which very quickly was clamped down upon, and they had re-elections until the Tsar got a legislature he liked, essentially.
There was no collapse, though. Yeah, right.
Experiment with democratization, or at least loosening, right? And that's the way you got democracies in other absolutist monarchies over time, right? You experiment with a legislature basically for the elite, and they become a counterweight to the king or whatever, and maybe that evolves. And in the Russian case, it didn't. So there are a lot of ways we could go with this, and I think the way I'll go here is that democracy is more than elections. And so when I think about 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, and sort of the way outsiders came to look at, or a lot of outsiders came to look at Russia was, well, as long as they have elections, what we really need to focus on is the change in the economy, right? Got to marketize the economy. And I don't want to get into too many, and some folks might think this and some folks might think that, but it distressed me at the time that if one of the things you wanted was democracy, why aren't you focusing on democracy? Why focus on economic change? What happened was massive disappointment with the use that was made of the opportunities that came when the Soviet Union fell apart. A lot of folks didn't feel like the economic changes helped them. A lot of folks didn't feel like the political changes helped them. And the political changes were identified with the economic changes, which were seen as a grab by the oligarchs or a grab by foreign powers or something like that. And so there was fertile ground in 1999, 2000, 2001 for someone like Putin to come along and say, I'm going to restore order, because the 90s were experienced as a horrible disorder and a horrible loss individually, not just sort of nostalgia for the Soviet days, but like living on the street, or lost my job, or, my purchasing power has been completely destroyed. I am worse off now than I was 10 years ago. And that's not some sort of, Russian flaw. They yearn for an iron hand. It's the same thing that people ask in democratic elections around the world. Are you better off now than you were before? And if the answer is no, vote for me instead of the party that got you where we are. And so that was a relatively easy card to play. And then Putin sort of restructured the political system and, expanded he sort of ran it as if he were a master spy, or heading a spy agency rather than running a government. So a lot of things have to happen for it to fall apart. But in the two experiments you're talking about, the two collapses, you get chaos. And if your effort during that time is not to continue to focus on democratic governance, but rather you use the chaos as an excuse to crack down, then that's what you're going to get. I think that chaotic periods are actually hard to come through with any sort of shared governance. It's easier to declare, I have to solve this problem in the short run, so give me all your civil liberties and we'll get out of this. And you never get your civil liberties back when that happens.
Yeah. All wars, including the wars in which the United States has been involved directly or indirectly, always impacts the domestic politics as well. The political party realignment, ideological realignment. So this war is no exception. On the America's political right, as well as on the left, I don't want to point only at the right because there's quite an opposition on the political left as well. People do oppose America's involvement in this war in Ukraine. To the fact that the United States helping Ukraine financially and militarily. What is your take on this? What would you say? Should United States continue support for Ukraine? What is at stake here, which pushes United States to help Ukraine and sustain Ukrainian war effort in general?
Right. And I think the objection in the United States from the left and the right comes from different reasons, which has sort of been an interesting feature of, I feel like, American politics since 2016, right? Is that folks on the far left and the far right have shared interests despite having different goals, which has been one of the reasons that U.S. politics has felt kind of weird for the last, 6 or 8 years. And the objections on the left go to a question you asked earlier, right? Sort of an argument that this war is driven by U.S. imperialism. And I think that's just factually wrong, right? So if your concern is U.S. imperialism, that should not lead you to argue the U.S. should stop funding Ukraine. Just factually, right? This is not being driven by U.S. interests. The U.S. would love, I think, sort of the center left would love to be able to pull out of Ukraine. The center right would love to be able to pull out of Ukraine. But the issue is that that's no guarantee of solving the problem either, right? The war is being driven by Russian imperialism, not American imperialism. The objections on the right, I'm not as clear on the justifications for. It's pitched basically as a budget thing, but we've got to spend that money somewhere else. It's not like there's a strong plan to sort of balance the U.S. budget that comes out of this. I'm not clear what the objection on the right is. So should is hard for me to say, but the things that are true is that the war is being driven by Russian imperialism, not American. And if Ukraine surrendered, there's no indication that it would stop. If Ukraine ceded some or all of its territory, there's no reason to think that Russia wouldn't then take, let's say, Moldova, Transnistria. Why wouldn't they incorporate Belarus directly? Why wouldn't they go back further into Georgia, Poland, Baltics? There's sort of no thought on sort of how this solves a problem. The problem at the moment on the ground is Russian expansionism. A legitimate question is, how do you stop that? But there's no sense that withdrawing support for Ukraine would stop that.
I have a speculative question. What would be your prediction for the final outcome of this war, taking into account existing military and the political realities on the ground right now?
Yeah, it really could go either way, which is frankly different from what I would have said the day after the invasion started. I was really pessimistic about Ukraine's chances at that point. I thought, wow, they'll put up a valiant fight, but the West won't get its act together, and Ukraine can only last for so long, and Russia vastly outnumbers them, right? I think that was sort of a popular quiet take at the time, not because folks were happy about it, but because it just looked like the reality. The Ukrainian military is better trained, better equipped, and sort of better than a lot of folks realized at the time. And it looks like the Russian military is not as good. Ukraine, the people of Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, the military of Ukraine have been surprisingly resilient, unbelievably so. Given that, that action plus outside aid has enabled Ukraine to continue to fight back for 2 years. I don't see any indication that Ukraine is ready to give up. So, the stalemate could continue for quite a while. I then, this past spring, thought that maybe Ukrainian pushback might be possible with the trouble that Wagner had. I thought, well, maybe Wagner will fall apart and there will be sort of the ability for Ukraine to push back through. That didn't happen. I'm not a military tactician, so it's hard for me to say, which leaves me with what I said at the start of this answer, which is I could see it going either way, right? That Russia could eventually win, that Ukraine could eventually push Russia out, which I think would probably mean a change of leadership at home. Doesn't necessarily mean democratization in Russia, but Putin would probably fall. If that happened, which probably means that Putin's ready to fight to the end, right? So I just think that both sides are completely committed to the fight. So it's hard to say how it will end.
Yeah, just as I guess any war of attrition, it's very hard to predict how it will end. There is a lot of criticism actually in Europe, especially in Eastern Europe, against the United States and the West in general, that the West is giving Ukraine just enough not to lose, but not enough to win the war outright. And many actually criticize very essence of American foreign policy, which sees Russia as a counterweight against China. American policymakers actually are afraid the defeat and then disintegration of Russia because they will lose this barrier, the pivot against China. So that's something also which I think must be taken into account, the policy direction.
I think that's a fair point. It requires some speculation on the part of various interests. And as somebody who doesn't know nearly enough about military tactics and so forth, I think it's easy to look at the situation and say the West is giving just enough to keep the balance between Ukraine and Russia on the battlefield, and it should give more. But it's not 100% clear what more would look like, right? What would it take? Not just to sort of give Ukraine the upper hand, but for a Ukrainian victory. I've been among those who've advocated sort of a no-fly zone or something like that. Other folks have said that would be too destabilizing. There are certainly things you could do, but it's not 100% clear what the outcome of those would be. As you say, it's a war of attrition. And so if this side steps up a little bit, the other side might step up a little bit. I have the way I vote at home, right? Because I think that the Ukrainian side is in the right here. And so I would support additional aid, but I can certainly understand the argument against. I know it's a hard sell. What I don't understand is the argument that, the West should withdraw support because that'll solve something, because I just don't think it will.
Do you think that Putin is really ideological? He's driven by the ideology. And do you really think that he's a conservative, or he's just using conservatism the same way that the Stalin, for instance, used the Marxist ideology in the Communist International in order to influence the left in the West, the same way as Putin is trying to influence the political systems and the conservatives in the West in order to undermine those political systems, because he feels that the wind is blowing from that side and the conservatism is on the rise in the Western world.
Right. A lot of pieces to that question, too. So, first of all, I can't read Putin's mind. I don't know exactly what he's thinking. One thing I can say is that for a long time, well before this invasion, before the 2014, annexation of Crimea, before the invasion of Georgia, all that, right from very early on, it does look pretty clear that Putin wants to weaken, change, replace the Western-dominated international system, right? That he thinks the system as it existed when he was first elected, the system as it exists now, is not structured in Russia's best interest. What exactly he wants to replace it with is a harder question. but he doesn't like the current one. NATO as the preeminent military organization, the EU as a dominant economic force, the World Bank, the IMF, right? He is not pleased with how those operate because he believes that they operate a system where Russia's at a disadvantage. Frankly, I don't think he's 100% wrong. But what's been interesting is to see the American right, the European right, start to argue that these systems that so heavily benefit Western states and the United States in particular attack those institutions as well, right? Seeing them as detrimental to, American growth or European growth. And I think that's just incorrect. That's the rise of the West after World War II in this environment has been extraordinary. And so it's been interesting to see the Western right attack the very institutions that made the rise of the West possible. I can't tell you whether Putin is feeding them this line. I can't tell you whether he's, bought them off or anything like that. But it certainly benefits him for the conspiratorial approach on the right to rise. And it's also clear that he has tried to foster it. Whether he's been sort of central to that happening is a different question. But he certainly benefits from the backbiting and the sort of criticism coming from the conspiratorial right and the conspiratorial left. But the right is the one that has power. But there is a weird shared interest between Putin and the conspiratorial right in the West.
And my last question is about the political science. Political science failed once again to predict another the massive event as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. And before that, it failed to predict another massive event, which was the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And before that, it failed to predict another fundamental event, which was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Obviously, we are political scientists. We love what we do. But my question is is political science the science which just keeps failing to predict the events of such a magnitude, or maybe we're asking just too much from the discipline? Is political science even required and fit to make scientific predictions about political and geopolitical events?
Yeah, yet another big question that often gets asked of scholars, how come you didn't predict this, that, or the other thing? So as a social scientist, I would ask what it would mean to predict something. Because I don't think anybody has, right, just like seismologists, right? You said it was a seismic event. Seismologists can't tell us the day and hour that the next earthquake in California is going to happen.
Sure.
And so, but they do say, listen, you're living on a fault line. There's going to be a massive earthquake at some point. And so, when the massive earthquake happens, I don't know that it would be fair to turn to seismologists and say, you didn't tell me, right? I didn't get to move out and, now my home is destroyed or whatever, right? So we sort of change what we mean by predict after the fact. Like you didn't get all the details right, or you didn't know exactly when it would happen, that sort of thing. Also, there's a question of whether a field makes a prediction as a whole or individual scholars, because also what happens is after the Soviet Union falls apart or after the invasion happens, individual scholars' work is rediscovered, right? Who said, listen, this system is fragile. It's not going to last forever. If it tries to reform itself, it might break. Or, if you don't show a strong face to Russia, they will, invade some additional, or they've already invaded Georgia. What would stop them from invading Ukraine? So if I were really going to do a systematic judgment of the social sciences and their abilities to predict, I would want to clarify that a whole lot better. I would want a better test than sort of after the, hindsight is 2020. How come you didn't tell me then what I know now? That's not really fair. Having said that, political science does seem best at sort of understanding stability in some settings, right? The easiest thing to predict is that tomorrow's weather will be a lot like today's weather. So now I'm moving to climatologists or meteorologists, right? Another group that gets blamed for not predicting exactly right things, but they can tell us that winter will be colder than summer. They can tell us that the planet is warmer now than it used to be. So anyway, I don't think that that social science is hopeless. I think that it's after the fact given impossible tasks. I'd love to talk more about it, but that's sort of my take that, our work is useful. We learn things that become useful, even if it's not exactly what people wanted at exactly that time.
Okay. Well, we will leave it here. Thank you very much, Dr. Barnes, for an interesting conversation, for coming to the podcast. Thank you all for joining in, and please do not forget to hit the subscribe button down below, and I'll see you on the next episode.